Thank you. So we're going to talk about Behat. I'll start with a bit of history first. About 6 years ago I started working at the company I currently work for. And when I switched to a position as backend developer. And we make APIs. And we have separate front-end developers that actually use those APIs to make many things. I wanted to make sure that those APIs did what they had to do. I wanted to test them. And at first I started using PHP unit, making unit tests. And that worked well. I tried to do the whole 100% code coverage thing, which didn't go that well. And then I decided, okay, I'm missing something. I have all these unit tests, small parts are being tested, small units work and do what they do, but the whole thing is not covered. I'm missing my configuration, I'm missing part of my network, I'm missing my routing. There's still a whole lot that can go wrong there. So, trying to look for making those end-to-end tests, I first tried to run PHP unit and then, well, since we're using Symfony, try to call the kernel class by itself. And then I had to fake all the requests by making my custom request objects, which was a hassle, took a long time. And I was like, okay, can I maybe do this over the web? So I tried to use an HTTP client, doing the same thing, but then we had to verify all kinds of response data in PHP unit, which was also a hassle. And then I stumbled onto Behat. Behat is a testing tool for PHP. It's a behavior testing tool, so you test the behavior of your application and not the code itself. It's written in PHP, and the main use for it is projects that are also written in PHP. The tests themselves are written in Gherkin, a testing language. The executed code that runs behind PHP, behind the Gherkin lines, is also in PHP, so it's very easy to write your own implementations for it. It supports extensions, and there's a lot of open source context available. And there's quite extensive documentation available online. Now, in this talk, I will show you how to install Behat. I will talk a little bit about Gherkin and how to write tests. I'll talk about context, which is the matching between the Gherkin lines and the code that's executed for your test. I'll have some information about hooks and tags. A little bit more in depth on the tests themselves are backgrounds and scenario outlines. Then I have a bunch of tips, things I ran into and might help you not do that. A bit of why we use Behat in this particular way, because apparently one of the maintainers was at my talk earlier, and he said it was very interesting but not actual good, a real way to use Behat. It wasn't intended to be used that way, but he still found it interesting. And then I have some time for a demo, a live demo, and questions. So first off, installing Behat. It's a composer package, so you just require it. Make sure you require it on dev, because you don't want this stuff in production. There's a Mink extension that we use. That's the actual web browser that's run behind it. We use the BrowserKit driver for it. There are a few different drivers that you can use to actually run your web browser, but Mink is the one that, BrowserKit is the one that works best for us. We have some extra context that we use. And well, we use the Symfony extension because then we can auto load and use the dependency injection for our context, but that's optional. You configure your Behat files in the features directory, that's where all your test files live. You have Behat directly in your tests for all your contexts. There's a YAML.dist file for your configuration and an optional .yaml file if you have some configuration for your local machine. The configuration file looks like this. You set up your default, and within there your suites. We only use one suite usually, so that's also called default. And then you list your context that you use within those within that suite. And you set up the extensions. The main extension has the base URL so that Behat knows where to go in order to call upon your test. Gherkin. Gherkin is a testing language, and it works with given, when, then. And it's in plain English. It's understandable without having to have any PHP knowledge. And it is structured in features, and features have scenarios, and scenarios have steps. I recently learned that those steps in Gherkin are called pickles. Given. In the given part of your test, you actually set up your state. Make sure that everything that you need to test is there. We usually set up some database data. Make sure that the database is populated with everything that we need for the test, but nothing more than that. You could use it to set some headers, make sure that the user is logged in, that kind of stuff. So this is an example. You start with the given, and Behat also uses and. And is whatever keyword was in front of it. So in this case, you make sure that there's a user. This will add a user to the database, and I'm logged in as that user, which generates a GWT token that will be added to the headers. The when part is the execution of the test itself. So in our case, it's usually when I send a request to a endpoint, and the then part checks if everything worked and did what it had to do. So we check the response status codes, we check the response types, we check stuff in the response itself or in the database in this case. So after this test is run, probably for adding a task, we need to make sure that the task actually exists in the database. So in a complete example, we have a feature for deleting tasks. Because, in my demo I made a to-do app like everyone does. You first describe the feature, then you describe the first scenario. As a user, I can delete my task. You set up your state, so you need a user, you need a task that's owned by that user, and you need to be logged in as that same user. Then you send a delete request, and then you check if the response code is okay, and if the task is actually deleted from the database. Yeah. The next scenario is that we don't want to have a user be able to delete a task that someone else made. So we change the original a little bit, and instead of just having a task that is owned by myself, I have a task that's owned by someone else. Same ID, same task, but because we cleared database in between, it's seen as a task from someone else. And you check that the response status code is okay. In this case of 404.
404 is not found.
I know. Why is that? We actually have the way we check if stuff exists or not is we use a query extension for API platform that does our API. And that in that extension we only list the stuff that people can see. So for this user, from their point of view, it doesn't exist.
Okay.
But yeah, you're right. You could also check for
403 maybe.
403, yeah.
Forbidden.
Yeah. Or 422 if need be, but yeah. And we check if the task is still there, because we can have the 404 as a response, and meanwhile the code still deleted stuff. So yeah. Contexts. Contexts are that missing link between PHP itself and working. Context is a PHP class. It provides the actual executable code for your tests. It has some matching that's either done by regex or by a little bit easier matching. If you use Symfony, these can be auto-wired. If not, you'll have to make sure that the dependency injection is wired in the Behat.yaml file. This is a very simple example. You need to make sure that the context is implemented, and you need to make sure that the context is listed in your configuration file. If we look at the given there is a user, we make sure that there's a function for it. The given there's a user matches the given there's a user and then a variable email. So that variable that is defined by the column is then used as the same name parameter in your function. That's the regex version. If you need to be a little bit more fancy with your naming, you can also use this for optional parameters. Then it will just check the groups that you define in your regex, and each group is then set as a parameter, and it's done in the same order as the groups are. So in this case, these two match. We have a bunch of open source contexts that we use. We have the REST context that we use for the actual checking if we use the REST context for the API calls themselves. We use the Mink context for the requests that are around it, and the JSON context to verify that the JSON response is correct. And especially the last one is used extensively. We use that for actual path searching in the response, for schema validation, all that kind of stuff. So the REST context is used for the sending a request, for delete requests, a post request with a body. The min context, we can check the status code, different versions. We can also say that we want to add specific headers before we do the request. And the JSON part is the JSON thing. You can check if it's JSON at all, which we also always add in our test, because as soon as someone forgets a var dump, this one will fail. You can check specific nodes. You can check specific nodes for specific values, and schema testing. Next up are tags. You can tag your tests, and you can tag your features and scenarios. Each tag is has an ampersand in front of it, and these tags you can use these tags to execute certain tests or exclude them from your test file. The tags that are on the feature are handled in a way that they actually count for each and every scenario within the feature. You can skip tags by adding the tile, or you can only run the test with a specific tag if you don't have the tile there. You can do that either in the command line, or you can do that in your test suite by default. There are also hooks, and hooks are parts of code that are executed at each before or after each suite, feature, scenario, or even step. These look like this. This is also in the context. So So your context class can have hooks as well. And then you add the add before scenario or feature or step or after scenario, feature or step or suite. And then this function will be executed before each and every, in this case before each and every scenario. If you need to have access to the scope of the test, so you want to know which tests have already been run, if the test already failed or not, maybe in this case to get other context, context can use each other, but if you make them dependent on each other, you get into the circular dependency hell. So you can use this in order to get the context that you need. And in this case, you get the scope. Each hook has its own scope. So it's, you don't really want to combine the hooks. There's a before scenario scope and after scenario scope, and each scope is slightly different because the context of what you're doing there is different. You can combine the text and hooks. In this case, this hook will only be called at the scenarios that have this specific tag, which is very handy for the reset database that we use, because we generally want to reset the database at every single test, but sometimes there are two different scenarios that you want to run next to each other, where one might be depending on the other. We try to avoid this as much as possible. In the test itself, we've already talked about the given, when, then. Backgrounds is a easy way to do things a bit dry. So if you have a bunch of scenarios in your feature, and each and every scenario has the exact same beginning, the exact same given, because you want to test the same kind of scenario, you can set a background. The backgrounds are run before each scenario inside that feature, but after the before scenario hooks are fired. So this is an example for the for a background. We have a feature where we add a tasks, and each scenario in this test has a user and a task. So in this case, we want to define it as a background, so we don't have to define it with each and every scenario. And then your scenario can either start with a given or start with a when immediately. Scenario outlines is a different kind of test that you can run. In that case, you create a template, and using that template, you can define variables in there, and then you execute that test that outline the template with those variables for each and every set of values that you define afterwards. You have a scenario outline like this. We use it a lot for validation warnings. So I have a body that I sent with email, password, and something. This something will we will use this something, and with the key, if you use email or password, it will override the previous value of your body. So in this case, we have a bunch of values that we want to run. You make a nice table out of it. Formatting doesn't really matter, but it's nice if you add some spaces. You set the variable, so that the actual keys for your variables, and then you define the values that you want to run. So in this case, we want to make sure that the 422 that we saw in the previous test, that status is given when you have an empty email, or an email that isn't an email, or any kind of password that isn't valid. Then we have some, I have some things that I want to share and how we use Behat a lot. One of the things that I find really handy is the stop on failure part. This makes sure that Behat runs it, and then the first test that fails, it stops. You can fix that, and then rerun the whole thing. You can run specific features by just adding the path, but if you want to run a specific test itself, you can add a colon and then the line number of your test, and then it will execute that single scenario. If your test has a background, it will include the background if you point it to a scenario. And a colleague of mine found this option a while back. The normal Behat gives you a whole lot of text, and if you don't want that, if you just want to have the nice filling up like in PHP unit with the dots and the e's, you can use the format this spoke has, and then you don't have the flowing green text. But I like the flowing green text a little bit better. It looks like yeah, you're doing stuff. When you're using JSON schema checks, make sure that you require your actually everything that's in an object. So you check your object, you check your properties, make sure that all of the properties that you have are in the required part. Just make sure that the test will fail if you forget to expose something. Normal, standard JSON schema checks, they don't check for that. They only go, okay, if it's there, it should be this, but if it's not, we don't fail, unless it's required. The other thing is the additional properties. Set this to false, because then your test will fail if you accidentally expose something that you shouldn't. Normal JSON schema checks don't warn about that. Unfortunately, you have to do this by each and every object that you test, so if you have objects within objects, you have to do this recursively. We had enough of this, and we actually made a bit of code in our context to do this automatically. But it's yeah. If you run your tests on your local machine and you want to use HTTPS with a self-signed certificate, you have to make sure that you either include the CA file or you skip the validation for it. You can set up your options for the browser kit in your Behat.yaml file. The HTTP client parameters, everything that's in there is the normal options that is passed to the HTTP client. But we had all of this. So why do we use Behat this way? Well, I really like that the features are readable. I can have this file, send it over to our front-end developers, and they can actually see how they need to use my API. They can see what to expect. Each and every scenario, they see, okay, if I have validation errors, I get a 422 and not a 400. If someone is not allowed to see something, I need to make sure that I handle the 404. You always have to write database state. One of the things that took me a lot of time developing is if you want, say you have a delete endpoint and your database schema is quite big and you need to make sure that you have a whole lot of data set up to actually delete that thing. And every time you manually test your delete endpoint, you need to go back into the database tool, add new rows, try to type new UUIDs, figure stuff out. It's a hassle, and then you have to you have to find out the ID that's supposed to go with it, and this whole bunch of work. I don't like to do it. With these tests, I can make sure that that's actually there before I test my test. I use my tests to develop because it's faster for me than doing things in the database manually 3 or 4 times. It tests the entire application, so not just that tiny part of code that function that you want to test, not just that bit of PHP and not your configuration, the whole thing. If you haven't set up your routes properly, tests will fail. If you don't set up your security properly, your tests will fail. If you forget a var dump, your test will fail. You need to make sure that you check both the API response and the new database state. Therefore, you always know that stuff actually works. It happened to me a couple of times that the response says, yeah, this post thing is created, The database says no. You need to make sure that that's there. And there's a pretty good integration with PHP Storm. There's a plugin for Behat which allows you to auto-complete your steps. So if you have your context set up, the plugin will know which context is which, and it can auto-complete those nice regex lines. It also has functionality. If you write your test and you have a bunch of steps, it will detect which steps cannot be matched. And then there's an option with Alt-Enter to add the test to a specific context. And you have to click through. So the control click, you go from your working to your context. So that's also very nice. It helps a lot. And for me, it gives my confidence. I know that my code works. I know that my stuff is properly done. I know that things do what they have to do as soon as I write those tests. We noticed this at our work. Beforehand, we had about 50-50 bugs in front end and back end. Right now, for us, the bugs that are actually bugs are not just a customer that doesn't explain what they actually want. For us, it's less than 10% of everything that goes wrong in the entire project. So it helps a lot. The amount of bugs that we have is quite minimal. So in conclusion, it's a tool. And as any tool, you can use it or you can just leave it, not have it. It doesn't replace unit testing. That's something very important. Unit testing still has a place in your work. Still has value, especially for calculations. Those things you want to unit test because it's smaller, it's faster. You don't want to write huge Behat tests and then see them fail somewhere halfway in the application, not even touching that one calculation thing that you wanted to test. If you're going to use it, talk to your team. Make sure that everyone's on board with this. Don't be that one person that adds the test, adds the new tool, and then the rest of the team goes like, I don't know what this is and I don't want to use it. Make sure that everyone embraces it. If you have a QA, include them as well. They can help you write these tests. They can, I mean, it's just plain English, so they can help, they can figure out scenarios, they can figure out new features. We have a few customers that we make sure that they write their tickets in a way that we more or less can copy the whole, at least the scenario line, into our feature files, with all the scenarios in it that are, when things go bad. And then we only have to, insert the status codes and the calls and endpoint naming. And think about what you want to test and what you don't want to test. I work at an agency. Budget is a thing. Customers have to pay for each hour that we work. So we test the things that we need to test. We make sure that the security is checked. We make sure that 404 statuses are checked. Each feature in our project has at least a happy trail. As a user, I can do this. When I'm not logged in, I get a 401. And when I'm logged in as someone different, I can either get a 403 or 404. Make sure that those are the least of your tests, so that, database, they happen less often. That's it for me so far. Do you have any questions so far?
Do you write your code, your test code, before writing your actual code?
Yes and no. It depends a little bit, as so many other things. No, I sometimes write my tests beforehand. I usually, when it's something that has a lot of checks and balances, I write my test first. If it's a more simple, just CRUD endpoint, I write the code first, and then the tests are out. Sometimes I write the code and then the context and then the test. Sometimes I write the test and then the code and then I forget that there's a context as well.
go with the flow.
Do you have any formal policies for pull requests? Do you require from all developers to write this kind of tests to accept their pull requests, or it's
Not yet, no. Because of the way that we work, small agency, we cannot enforce it. But if a more, it happens mostly with newer developers. If they forget to add a test, I will make a note and then ask them, could you write a test for this scenario? Or could you write tests at all? But we don't want to enforce it because we don't want to make sure, we want to make sure that if something happens with a customer, if something needs to be done and there's little time, we can just do it. But if you work in a bigger team, if your team is dedicated on one project, I would definitely make sure that that's part of your procedure.
You mentioned at some point the customers not really saying what they actually want. Do you ever communicate the working scenarios with the customers?
I did with a few. Most of them don't really like when I try to talk tech, but there are a couple that are very interested in it, and they actually
Especially since you don't really need the actual for status codes you get, but in terms of the behavior, it's more understandable for that as well.
Yeah.
Most people don't like it.
No, so if you test your behavior as a fully end-to-end, and you include the front end with it, it's easier for them to understand what happens. The customer doesn't see that we are using the backend. He doesn't see that we have an API.
The specific way you're using
Exactly.
it's only really relevant to share it with front-end developers.
Yeah.
Okay.
I also had a discussion with some people that this is not end-to-end because front-end, from my perspective as a backend developer, this is the end to the end.
You stated that you have way less bugs on the back end compared to the front end. Is it because of the test actually catch errors you make, or is it because you think better about what you're actually going to build and prevent?
Both.
Okay.
Both. We do notice that the tests pick up stuff, especially when upgrading code and packages. We use API platform, and API platform has been really bad with the Semver lately. They have the habit to change default values in minor releases. We have a boilerplate project that we actually base all our other projects on. The boilerplate has Behat tests. The Behat tests for the boilerplate run nightly with the newest version of all my packages. Whenever PHP platform tries to do something that they shouldn't, I get an email the next morning that the test failed. So I know beforehand, and I can warn the rest of the developers, don't upgrade, or upgrade and make sure that these bits of configuration are in your config files. Make sure that you add this false because someone made it true by default. So in that case, it prevented bugs quite a bit. And we had those scenarios where someone removed one single line in the configuration, and all of a sudden the security check wasn't there anymore, and nobody noticed because nothing went wrong with the test. We would have noticed. And now we write those tests. We actually make sure that those fail. The tests are also part of our CI, by the way. So whenever a pull request is made, the feature tests are run. And I've heard of people that go like, yeah, but doesn't it take a lot of time? I mean, our end-to-end tests take like 15 minutes to run. These don't. The biggest project we have runs their tests within a minute. And those are quite a bit. Any other questions? Because then I have demo.
Maybe a question about the database. You say you prepare the database. Do you run that in a Docker container or something?
You can. Some of our developers run it in a Docker container, but then they also run the tests in that same container. So you have the container set up with a service for the database and a service for PHP. You run the Behat test in CLI on your container, and then you can just internally clear your database. I run everything bare metal because Docker and Mac really didn't go well together when I started working on this stuff, and I haven't had the heart to switch ever since. And also with a lot of projects, with Docker it's faster to switch if you have multiple different versions of PHP, but it's also a lot harder on your memory if you have 7 or 8 projects that you want to run at the same time. Where's my mouse? Okay. So, if I now run Behat, it runs all my tests, and this is how fast it is. That's 16 scenarios, so 104 steps within 2.5 seconds. So, and this tests the whole CRUD stuff of the task, user login, refresh token, and I think part of the JWT stuff. One of the things that, okay, this is a bit difficult now. So one of the things that happens to us a lot is that, say you have your API, and source entity. I have my task here, and the task is exposed. So we have these serialization groups which for us define if something is exposed or not. What happens a lot of times is that you know what? Someone forgets to do this part. So they forget to expose something. If I now run my Behat test again, you will see that the test fails. You check your the schema. It requires the title property, and that's why you need to have all your properties in the required part. And it gives you an exception because title isn't there. If on the other hand, instead of title, I accidentally expose something that I shouldn't, like the entire user. And I rerun my Behat test. It will also fail. It says now that the property owner is not defined and shouldn't be allowed. This is why you have to allow extra properties false. So that's one data lead lesson, which is always a good thing. The same goes with the issues with checks and balances. I have, where did I put that? Yeah, we use a little bit different layout here than we use in our projects. So it's a bit of a search for me. Up there. Here. So I wrote a little bit of a query extension. This is something for PHP platform itself, and it will look for these when running a query to access a specific resource. So in this case, if you do something with tasks, if you either pull a list or a single task, it will execute this because the resource class is task, and then it will run the apply function, and you add some stuff to the query builder. If you don't do that, so say I have disabled that, or the class isn't there, or the class is not wired for some reason. And I run my tests. Because I always have that you're not allowed to do this by someone else, this test now fails. Because instead of the 404 you get a 200, or a 204 in this case. And you delete a task that's not yours, which shouldn't have happened. So your test failed. This makes sure that everything, single security check that's in your code somewhere, either configuration or code or some event listener or whatever fancy thing you use, it gets picked up by your test. I told you a bit about that plugin. Let me show you that as well. So we have your feature for limit task. And this one, for example, there's a task on by. If I hit complete, then it goes to the task context, which is where all of the lines that have something to do with my task are. And then it goes to that function that does that part. So that's really good. Any other things that you would like to see while I'm here?
Maybe not for the demo, but you stated before that you used the tool differently than what it was intended. So where is it different? Because I'm not familiar with the tool and how it's.
So normally if you have your Behat tests, you have things like when I delete a user, instead of when I send a delete request to /user/ something, or when I log in, or the whole behavior is even more from the outside than we use it. So we got in somewhere in the middle on just the backend part. I tried to use it that way, but that means that I had to write a whole lot more context, because each and every line, like when I delete a task, I have to implement that. And now I don't have to, because there's a context that implements a general when I send a request to something. So that saves me a lot of time. And yeah, for us it's a little bit easier for the front-end developers, because they can see what endpoint to call instead of when I delete a task. Yeah, how do you delete a task? Docs. Right? That's it then.